who over the last 44 years, Jim, has published somewhere between 12 and 14 books. We can dispute that, I think. I think that's an historical fact that needs to be debated and critiqued. But today he's going to be speaking about his most recent one, Insurrection, Scotland's Famine Winter. And that was published in 2019. And I believe, Jim, that a paperback is going to come out within the next year or so. Jim can maybe correct us on that in a minute. But before Jim gets started, I just want to point to a few features of this lecture. What we're doing is part of our History Talks live series. The next one is on Thursday, the 13th of August, from 12 to 1 again, and it features Ian Robertson, my colleague, on land occupations in the Highlands after 1914. Just to mention that today's session is being recorded, a video is being made, and if you would prefer for yourself not to appear in that video at all, I would advise you to just put your cursor on the screen, and you should see some black buttons along the bottom. The one on the far left is to mute your mic, so that's a very useful one because that improves the audio quality, but the one next to that is to turn your camera off, and that means that your image won't appear on the screen. So should you prefer that, that is what to do. That will also improve the so yeah, just if you could remember to mute yourself, that would mean your microphone button is red. So when it's black, your microphone is actually on. If you could turn it, that would be great. Now, in terms of asking questions, Professor Hunter is going to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and we've got an hour here. So there will be an opportunity at the end of the talk to ask questions. Not for everybody, I'm afraid, but the way to do that would just be to switch your mic on and come in and ask a question. But don't be too concerned if you feel like you haven't had a chance to ask your question. We will be continuing on Twitter to have a discussion around this using the History Talks live hashtags. And if you have questions, I can direct them at Professor Hunter. We can seek to ask them ourselves, but hopefully that will help. We'll also have the video, and you can go back and look at that, and obviously email us through the UHI Centre for History as well if you'd like some follow-up on any aspect here. Okay, so Professor Jim Hunter then, my former boss, is an emeritus professor in history at the University of the Highlands and Islands and a senior researcher. He founded the Centre for History in 2005, having had a career following completion of his PhD in history as chair of the Scottish Crofters Union, as chair of Highlands and Islands Enterprise from 1998 to 2004. And as I mentioned, he's published a very large number of books and articles on Highlands and Islands history, somewhere between 12 and 14. I can't quite count properly on that, it seems. So I'm just going to pass over to Jim, who's going to talk about an aspect of his book. And then with the discussion, it's obviously up to us the kind of questions we ask, but I think Jim is particularly keen to discuss the making of the book because in some ways he's used a different approach in this book, different types of sources, and I found that really interesting, so I'll be keen to explore that. But I'm going to pass over to Professor Hunter now to give his talk, and then probably by around 12:35, 12:40, we'll move to the questions session, and I'll lead on that. So over to you, Jim.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And I should say by way of warning that our family are with us at the moment, or some of them, for the first time, obviously, for many months. And so if a 5-year-old interrupts, you'll know why. And what I propose to do, as David said, is just talk a little bit about the book, give a kind of insight into what it contains. So it's just a kind of snapshot of some of the episodes that are away from the book. And I'll do that over the next half hour. Most of the action of this book, I should show it to you, just in case you haven't seen it. And most of the action that it describes and analyzes took place within just about 10 weeks. So it's a very short time scale. And that was in early 1847. But to start with, I'm going to say something about a period just a little later than that, from mid-August in the same year, 1847. And three women are walking down the road from Newton Moor to Kinlochnagan in the Central Highlands in Edinburgh. And their names are Isabella Main, Margaret Main, and Mary Jack. And they're strangers to these parts, and if you'd been there, you'd have known that from their conversation, because they were speaking not Gaelic like most folk in that city at that time, but the Scots or Doric dialect of a village on the Murray coast, a place called Hopeman. And Mary, Margaret, and Isabella had walked all the way from Hopeman, and that's perhaps 80 miles. So why had they made this long journey? Well, not far from Kinlochnagan is Ardverky, and that summer Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were in residence there. This was the couple's first extensive jaunt into the Highlands, and so taken on were they with the area, despite the fact that the weather in the summer of 1847 was utterly appalling, that they bought their own pad in the Highlands shortly afterwards at Balmoral. But Isabella and Margaret and Mary had come to see the Queen, not to catch sight of her from a distance. That wasn't what they were about at all. They hoped to meet with her, to speak with her, and ask her to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy in the case of three men who were then in London's Millbank prison, huge prison block beside the Thames, awaiting shipment to a penal colony in Australia. The Millbank prisoners were Daniel Sutherland, John Young, and John Main, who were fishermen. Sutherland was 24, Young was 21, and Main was 18. And in March that year, a few months earlier than this, they'd been before Scotland's High Court on charges of mobbing, rioting, and assault. The trial was brief because they all pled guilty, and in part it seems they did so because they'd been advised that this would minimize their punishment. Well, it didn't. Each was sentenced to 7 years transportation, which at that time was the heaviest sentence available to a court short of execution. These sentences, or so it was thought by Mary, Margaret, and Isabella, might be overturned by Queen Victoria if only she could be persuaded to listen to their explanation of why that should be done. Isabella was David Sutherland's mother, Margaret was John Main's mother, and Mary, not the youngest of the three women, was Daniel's wife, and she was the mother of the couple's baby boy, who'd been born, their first child, who'd been born when his father was already in Millbank back in May. Well, the Hopeman women never did meet Queen Victoria, which is perhaps unsurprising. But what is surprising is that they did meet at Ardverky a senior member of the British government. This was Earl Grey, who was the colonial secretary in Lord John Russell's Whig or Liberal administration. And this was a time when the head of state, the Queen, was out of London, a cabinet minister had to accompany her. And in this case, Lord Earl Grey had drawn the short straw it were. And I find this meeting a fairly extraordinary episode in the sense that it's very, very difficult today to imagine a cabinet minister, and as he was, a very senior British English aristocrat, sitting down with three fisherwomen from a place on the Murray coast like Hopeman. But he did that. And he told them that if they drew up a clemency petition, it would, he said, be laid before the sovereign. And then he listened, Grey listened, as the three told their story. And that story, no doubt, touched on the pretty grim circumstances that had caused John Main, John Young, and Daniel Sutherland, and thousands of more people to break the law. And what these circumstances were is what my book is all about. And the first of one or two short readings from the book. When George Poole made his way into the Barra township of Birlinn, On the morning of Wednesday, 13th January 1847, he was confronted by the sort of crisis a later age would call a humanitarian catastrophe. The immediate cause of the misery affecting this crofting settlement's 26 families was a runaway plant disease that had deprived them of potatoes. That wouldn't have mattered had alternative foodstuffs been in quantity, but that wasn't the case. Barra, said by a 16th century cleric to be fertile and fruitful in corn, might once have been a grain-producing locality where oatmeal and barley meal were common foodstuffs. Now, little of either was to be got on an island where nearly every scrap of arable land was given over to potatoes. In Birlinn, George Poole reported, "I found few families with any meal at all. What he did find on entering homes in what he called this little village, diarrhea and typhus, standard accompaniments of famine." Well, George Poole worked for the Commissariat. This was a government agency whose job was to ensure that fighting troops were well provisioned in time of conflict, and an agency now tasked with famine relief. First in Ireland, where potato blight arrived in 1845, and then here in the Highlands, where blight came a year later. In Ireland, all of it, of course, then part of the UK, relief efforts helped ensure that through the closing months of 1845, the early months of 1846, there were no deaths from hunger. Sometimes forgotten aspect of the Irish famine, that relief measures in the first winter of the famine and into the next spring were actually very effective. But blight's return in the summer, plus a change of government policy, which I won't go into, changed all that, as made plain by a letter that appeared in the Times newspaper, on Christmas Eve, 1846. This letter was written by Nicholas Cummins, who was a Cork City businessman, and he was just back from what was in effect a mercy mission to a place called Skibbereen. And this is another short reading. Being aware that he should have to witness scenes of frightful hunger, as he wrote, Cummins, before leaving home, had filled his carriage with as much bread as 5 men could carry. Some of that bread was intended for Southreen, a West Cork townland of which Cummins had previous knowledge. On reaching the spot, he wrote, I was surprised to find the wretched hamlet apparently deserted. I entered some of the hovels to ascertain the cause, and the scenes that presented themselves were such as no tongue nor pen can convey the slightest idea of. In the first, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearance dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horsecloth. I approached with horror, and found by a low moaning that they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had once been a man. It's impossible to go through the detail. Suffice to say that in a few minutes, I was surrounded by at least 200 of such phantoms. Well, that same month, December 1846, William Fraser Tytler, who was Sheriff of Inverness, began to warn that things in some parts of his county were on the way to being as bad as those in Ireland. Fraser Tytler's big concern was Inverness's islands, especially the outer isles from Harris southward through the Uist. That's why George Poole, as I mentioned a moment ago, was sent to Barra. Why he was followed there by Charles Shaw, who was the sheriff substitute of Lochmaddy in North Uist, instructed to take sworn statements from families of folk in Barra who died of hunger. Another brief reading telling something of what Shaw discovered. In Borv, Neil MacNeil spoke about his 4-year-old son who had died just days before. He and his family, MacNeil said, were so lacking in resources that for months they'd depended upon the charity of friends. Those friends, however, were themselves so scarce, as MacNeil said, that they had little food to spare. Sometimes it followed there were days when the only thing tasted by MacNeil, his wife, and their 5 children was warm water. Such little oatmeal as they got from neighbours being eked out so sparingly that during the last fortnight of his life, the boy who died and whose name isn't known could be given no more than about a gill of thin gruel, sometimes once, sometimes twice in each 24 hours. A gill's a quarter pint. Thin gruel was water mixed with oatmeal, perhaps a spoonful or two of oatmeal, not very much. He never complained of pain, Neil McNeill said of his dead son, but he wasted away day by day till he became so weak that he could not sit up, and he at last expired in the early morning of Friday, 15th January. His little boy hadn't tasted a morsel the previous day, McNeill added, because there was nothing to give him. Now, such horrors, you might think, might have sparked a protest, but in the islands there was no protest, nor on the west coast mainland of the Highlands, where things were just as bad. And on reflection, I think that's perhaps not so surprising, where life-threatening hunger as a population firmly in its grip, mass protest happens rarely. Where protest is more likely is in places where starvation, though not actually occurring, is thought very likely. In other words, it's coming over the horizon. And where that's the case, folk fearing for their families may do whatever's going to do whatever might stop this disaster overwhelming them. And that's what happened all around the Moray Firth in the early part of 1847. Now, around the Moray Firth, and I'm talking about the whole coastline from Aberdeen, more or less, right up to Caithness, dependence on potatoes was less total than further west. But working people, in particular in these communities, relied heavily on potatoes all the same. And with potatoes gone, because of blight, they had to turn to the next best thing, which was oatmeal. And the price of oatmeal shot up to an extent that made it unaffordable. And in part, that was because it was more profitable for landlords and for farmers and meal dealers to sell meal and oats and barley in big quantities for shipment south to Leith or even London, where demand, again because of blight, was that winter exceptionally high. Making matters worse, in towns and villages around the Moray Firth was a collapse in fishing income. Demand for salted or cured herring had dried up, not least because the Irish market, which was a major market at that time for salt herring, had been lost because of the famine. While the storms and blizzards of that bitter winter, it was an appallingly bad winter in terms of snow and gales. The storms, the more or less incessant storms, meant that whitefish catches hit an all-time low as well because people simply couldn't go out to fish. And the fishing slump fed into bad times for lots of other trades. So in household after household, there was less money available. At the very point when, with potatoes gone, more cash was needed if folk were to get by. Now, everybody knew how terrible things were in Ireland. That was common knowledge right around the coast. And they knew also how bad things were becoming in the West Highlands and in the Hebrides. So how they wanted to stave off famine near at home. And to many people, it seemed obvious that the one way to bring prices down would be to keep grain in the north, because the hinterland of these Moray Firth coastal communities were grain-producing localities, producing a lot of grain in some instances. And so what they wanted to do was stop shipments of grain to the lowlands and to England. Now, this the authorities refused to do. That would have been to interfere with trade, with the free market, and politically that was thought to be impossible. But soon, grain shipments had been halted all the same by direct action on the part of very many people. On Friday, 15th January, a big grain trading port, Macduff in Banshire, was blockaded and closed down. And soon similar protests spread along the coast, east and south, to Fraserburgh, to Aberdeen, west to Buckie and Port Gordon, Garmouth, Lossiemouth, and then to Burghead. There, at Burghead, on Monday, 25th January 1847, grain merchant John Allen from Elgin, the biggest grain merchant in Moray at that time, was planning a big shipment of oatmeal to Grangemouth aboard a locally owned cargo vessel called the James and Jessie. And I just turned over 2 pages at the same time, so bear with me. And this is another reading describing what happened in Burghead that Monday morning. When fishing families in Burghead and nearby localities were finding it harder and harder to purchase oatmeal, the sight of so much meal being sent elsewhere was calculated to produce at the minimum a great deal of outrage. This outrage was most acute in Hopeman, which is no more than an hour's walk from Burghead, and a place where, perhaps because it was entirely fisheries reliant in a way that Burghead itself wasn't, the downturn in cash returns from fishing had hit especially hard. Given this circumstance, it was perhaps predictable that on news of John Allen's planned shipment reaching Hopeman, there would be backing in the village for an attempt to keep his meal in money. This attempt took definite shape on the Monday immediately preceding the planned departure of the James and Jessie. That afternoon, it was reported, quote, a great many fishermen marched out of Hopeman and headed in procession for Burghead. The Hopeman marchers, said Burghead's harbour master, Crystal, congregated about my office. They'd come over, they told Crystal, to stop the shipment of meal until they were satisfied that there was plenty in the county, meaning money. And Crystal, trying to convince the crowd, soon joined by a growing number of Burghead people, that there was in fact no shortage. He was told that if this was indeed the position, meal should be retailing more cheaply. Not allowing meal to be shipped, someone remarked, might bring the price down. Obstructing lawful shipments, Crystal retorted, might well result in the military being called in to restore order. He did not care a farthing for the military, said Daniel Sutherland, a fisherman whose wife and mother would afterwards walk from Hopeman to Inverary to press for his release from prison. Even if some of them might be shot, Sutherland insisted, they would have meal at their own price. Now, neither in Burghead nor anywhere else would any grain be stolen that winter. No one wanted food for nothing. They didn't want handouts. They wanted meal, oatmeal, at a fair price, what they considered a fair price, a price they could afford. Well, that same Monday, Murray's sheriff principal was heading north. This was a man called Cosmo Innes, who was an Edinburgh-based lawyer, and he was, incidentally, a pioneer historian of Scotland's Middle Ages, and his name is still remembered amongst historians in that context. Well, Cosmo Innes now tried to get together a force of special constables from Murray's respectable residence. It's worth perhaps pointing out at this stage that police forces were minimal or non-existent at this time in Scotland. And they certainly didn't have the manpower needed for anything approximating to what we would call crowd control. But sheriffs were entitled to raise forces of special constables, and they would consist typically of shopkeepers, businessmen, lawyers, people like that, people who were thought to have a stake, as it were, in the community and wouldn't countenance lawlessness. And when you were summoned as a special constable, that was a legal obligation. But folk weren't eager to comply. Not everyone in Murray or elsewhere approved of riot and disorder, obviously, but there was, for all that, a great deal of sympathy right across the community for what the Burghead people were trying to achieve, which was to keep Murray's grain crop in Murray. There was a lot of sympathy for that. Well, by late morning Wednesday, Sheriff Innes had recruited. He had some difficulty recruiting anyone at all, but eventually he'd scraped together 60 special constables. Also by late morning at Burghead, a big group of women had unloaded all John Allen's oatmeal from the James and Jessie and returned it to his warehouse by the quayside. So the situation that awaited Sheriff Innes and his men when they got to Burghead was nothing if not tense. A violent and bloody confrontation followed, the sheriff and his party ending up besieged in an inn, obliged to enter talks, in effect, with the protest leaders, which, from the point of view of a sheriff, of course, was a fairly humiliating situation. Eventually, the sheriff and his constables were allowed to leave Bankhead, but only after they'd agreed to hand their batons, the heavy batons that they were supposed to use against the crowd. They had to hand these batons to the crowd, and they had to free 2 prisoners they'd managed to take. In Elgin, meanwhile, there had been a massed attack on John Allen, the grain dealer's home in King Street in Elgin. Its windows were all smashed, while some attempt was made to set the place on fire. A young man called John Lawrence was arrested in the wake of this disturbance and conveyed to Elgin Jail, just beside the church in the High Street in these days, where next night a massive crowd forced Sheriff Innes to set John Lawrence free. So the authorities, now lacking police, special constables, clearly no use, turned for backing to the military. By Saturday, there was a naval gunboat off Baghead. By Monday, Sheriff Innes had 200 armed troops at his disposal, who now set about enforcing law and order in Baghead and all the other centres where trade had been disrupted, like Findhorn, Lossiemouth, Garmouth. By early February, then, most of Moray was quiet, but that wasn't true of the north as a whole, with unrest spreading into Inverness, Bewley, Och, Cromarty, Dingwall, Invergordon, and to Pulteney Town, Wick's harbourside community. And the illustration on the cover of this book shows what was about to transpire in Pulteney Town. And this is another reading from the book. In 1847, no part of Pulteney Town was more than 30 years old. The town, a place of numerous business premises and hundreds of stone-built homes, had been laid out to the west and south of the harbour that had given rise to it. From this harbour, there were various ways of getting to the bridge connecting Pulteney Town with the much older borough of Wick. Of these, one of the most direct consisted, as it still does, of Bank Row, which after a few hundred yards becomes Union Street. Along Bank Row and into Union Street at about 9 o'clock in the evening of Wednesday, 24th February 1847, there marched some 30 men of the British Army's 76th Regiment. For the previous 3 or 4 hours, those men, together with 70 comrades, had battled with people intent on preventing what the army was there to facilitate. Caithness produced grain being taken aboard a waiting cargo vessel. While trying in vain to clear Pulteney Town of protesters, bayonet-wielding troops had drawn blood from at least 50 individuals. Increasingly enraged crowds, for their part, had begun by shouting, yelling, and spitting at the soldiers, before going on to assault them with sticks, staves, stones, and filth. Understandably then, the troops making their way into Union Street were not in the best of tempers. Their mission was to convey to jail in Wick 2 Pulteney Town men, John Shearer and James Nicholson. And when from doorways facing on to Bank Row, a handful of residents tried to block the soldiers' progress, these folk, men, women, youngsters, were instantly and roughly brushed aside. Bank Row was and is flanked on both sides by houses. But on reaching Union Street, the military found that though still protected by buildings to their right, they were open to attack from the left. On that side, Union Street was bordered only by the steep embankment, separating it from Cinque Terrace, a parallel but higher roadway which that Wednesday night was occupied by hundreds of people, all aiming to inflict as much damage as possible on the troops below. Today, the slope between Cinque Terrace and Union Street is fenced and wooded. In 1847, however, there were neither trees nor fences to obstruct the missiles that now descended on the soldiers. On getting into Union Street, the commander reported, he and his men were at once exposed to tremendous volleys of large stones. So heavy were some of those stones that one of them shattered the wooden stock of a soldier's musket. Others, curving down from high above, inflicted injury after injury on men whose progress was brought to a halt. I was struck with stones several times, said Corporal Cormac Dowd. My arm was black from a severe blow, said Private John Carr. A stone knocked the firelock from his grasp, said Private Richard Brew. The stones were rattling on our bayonets, said Private Daniel Connolly. I was hit between the shoulders and knocked flat. to the ground. Well, with the troops was Caithness Sheriff Robert Thompson, who, when also struck with stones, said to the army officer beside him that he should open fire. There followed the smoke and crash of a military musket volley, a thing never before experienced in Caithness. Bloodshed predictably ensued. Well, in the wider story that my book tells or tries to tell, there are both villains and heroes, so to speak. Among the villains is Colonel John Gordon of Cluny, Aberdeenshire laird and absentee owner of Barra, South Uist and Benbecula, a Scrooge-like character who was both extremely rich and quite astonishingly mean. But there were good guys too, like Invernesshire's Sheriff, William Fraser Tytler, whom I mentioned, who lived in some style at Aldari Castle at the top end of Loch Ness. Well, Fraser Tytler was, as I've said, very much concerned about the famine's impact on the islands. One of these was Birlinn, on the south side of the Sound of Harris, where in November 1846 a cargo ship was wrecked. The Greenock-owned Superb, inward bound to Glasgow from New York, with 6,000 barrels of flour. Well, under cover of darkness, barrel after barrel of flour began to be taken off the ship by men whose families were starving. This was criminality. I believe the greater part of the population of Birlinn, at 800 in number, are involved in the business, said Charles Shaw, Fraser Tytler's substitute or depute in Lochmanny, as I mentioned. For lack of evidence, Shaw went on, he'd managed to arrest just 8 men from the island, men honest or foolish enough to admit to having gone one night to the Superb and taken home 16 barrels of flour. These men Shaw now accused of theft and shipped them off to Inverness to a just completed cell block in the castle. The castle, despite being called a castle, had just been built at this point. Nothing of this pleased Shaw's superior, Sheriff William Fraser Tytler. The Birlinn 8, he felt, should have been tried and dealt with mildly in Lochmanny. At his insistence, they were granted special privileges. They also got a visit from Fraser Tytler himself. With the help of an interpreter, the jailed men having little English, the sheriff in the castle took down some details of what life was like in Birlinn. Clearly moved by what he'd heard, Fraser Tytler now wrote to Lord Advocate Andrew Rutherford, who was at this time the government's main man in Scotland. He couldn't, said the sheriff, and this was the phrase he used, he couldn't get these poor fellows out of his head. He'd had them bailed and taken to Aldari, where they worked on drainage projects, then ongoing. Days later came the news that Rutherford agreed with Fraser Tytler's plan to have the Birlinn men admonished and released. With the help of the Aldari parish minister, a Gaelic speaker, this was done. At the sheriff's own expense, the 8 were put aboard a steamer and sent down the Caledonian Canal to Oban, from where they got another steamer home. Now, I find that in some ways remarkable, which is why I've mentioned it today, because, not least because it runs so counter to the notion that Victorian justice was invariably implacable and harsh. It's hard to imagine a sheriff behaving in that way today, I think. And another of the good guys, as it were, who feature in the book, a man called Norman MacLeod, a Church of Scotland minister in Glasgow. And a final short reading. On a summer's day in 1847, Norman MacLeod, a man who'd worked tirelessly to raise funds for Highlands and Islands famine relief, saw for himself what prolonged hunger does to people. MacLeod had spent a weekend in North Uist. Now he and 1 or 2 companions were moving on to South Uist by way of Benbecula and by way of the fords connecting these 3 islands. We started on Monday morning for South Uist, MacLeod reported. The scene which we witnessed as we entered the estate of Colonel John Gordon of Cluny was deplorable, nay, heartrending. On one beach, the whole population of the country seemed to be gathering the precious cockles. Cockles were one of the few sources of nutrition. Hundreds of people with creels, men, women, and naked children, all at work. We met a crowd of people at the fords. I never witnessed such countenances. Starvation on many faces. The children with their melancholy looks, big looking knees, hollow eyes, swollen like bellies. God help them. I never witnessed such wretchedness. I never did witness such wretchedness. Think about that phrase, big looking knees, hollow eyes, swollen like bellies. We've all, at one time or another, I guess, seen images of children like that on Oxfam adverts of some years back, in television coverage from sub-Saharan Africa. These children are affected by what's called kwashiorkor, described by the NHS website as, quote, a severe form of malnutrition, whose effects include loss of muscle mass, an enlarged tummy, and all the other symptoms Norma MacLeod described. Today, according to the NHS, kwashiorkor is confined to, quote, developing regions of the world where babies and children have a diet that lacks protein and other essential nutrients. But in 1847, there was no lack of kwashiorkor here in Scotland. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jim. Really appreciate the talk. And there's a huge number of lines of inquiry that we could follow up from this. Before I open up the discussion to other people in the audience, I wanted to just ask you about the sources that you'd used, because what came out today and comes through at many points in the book is the detail of the sources that you have, these personal accounts of the soldiers and the events in Pulteney Town, which I've never read about before, but you bring alive very short periods of time and hugely eventful moments within a period of, as you say, 2 to 3 months, which is quite different from some of your other books where you've looked at much longer periods. So, for example, the one I always focus on is Last of the Free, which covers several millennia. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about that process for this book of gathering this exceptionally powerful material on what is quite a short period of 2 to 3 months, and what those sources were and what some of the features of that research were for you. What were the challenges and what were the things you most enjoyed about that?
Well, the gestation of this in terms of the sources I used it goes back a long way. It goes back to around about 1972 when I was doing my research and my PhD thesis at Edinburgh University and spending a lot of time in what was then called the Scottish Record Office. And looking at catalogues, I saw I was writing about the evolution of crofting and focusing particularly on episodes like the Land League and the protest movement of the 1880s and so on. And I saw a mention in our catalogue of some material that was unsorted and in a couple of boxes and was labelled simply Disturbances in the North. And so I thought that sounds promising, so called it up and had a look. And it became evident that this was a mass of highly detailed correspondence and reports and papers about the events that I've just been touching on. But from my perspective at that time, because the focus of all of this material was around the Moray Firth area, Inverness, Fraserburgh, all these places, it was of interest, but it wasn't directly relevant because my focus was on the crofting heartlands of the West Highlands and the Hebrides. So I kind of took a mental note of this, and I thought if I go on to become an academic historian, as I vaguely aspired to be, I guess, at the time, I'll come back to this because there's clearly an article here for the Scottish Historical Review or some such. Well, as it happened, my career took another, such as it is, or such as it was, took another turn, and I ended up doing journalism and lots of other things. So I didn't have the opportunity to follow the thing up immediately, but it stuck with me. In the interim, back in 1982, Eric Richards published an article, a sort of supplement to Past and Present, an academic journal, based on the same material to some extent. And the article was called The Last Scottish Food Riot. So when I finally got round 3 or 4 years ago to thinking about revisiting this topic myself, I got in touch with Eric and said that's what I was intending to do. And he, as always with Eric, he was very encouraging and said he felt he'd, written about it, but there was a lot more to bring out, so to speak, and that he looked forward to discussing my results with me. We didn't always agree about our respective interpretations of history. But sadly, of course, in the interim, Eric died, and so that conversation never took place. But the material in question was highly detailed. It was reports that were being submitted to Edinburgh by procurators fiscal and sheriffs and others on a sometimes daily basis, and sometimes more than daily. Sometimes, like the procurator fiscal in Inverness at the height of the troubles there, was writing 2 or 3 letters a day to Edinburgh. And so there is an awful lot of detail, and there's further material that at that time wasn't catalogued at all, but now is much more effectively. What are called precognitions, the inquiries that sheriffs would make or law officers would make in advance of trials. And these are sworn testimony from prospective witnesses and victims and so on. And that's still a feature of the run-up to a trial in Scotland. And these survive. And the stories I touched on with regard to Barra, for instance, which Shaw, the sheriff depute in Lochmaddy, took, he wasn't looking to organise a trial, but he was taking sworn statements to establish just how serious the situation was there. So you get a lot of highly detailed testimony, and that's, I suppose, increasingly, maybe it's a manifestation of encroaching age. That's a history that interests me increasingly, not so much a sort of painstaking socioeconomic analysis, but the story of people, what a journalist, and as I said, I've been a journalist, what a journalist, I guess, would have called human interest. And I think it's very possible in this episode to bring out an awful lot of that sort of detail, so that you get the story of people who were suffering and protesting, and also the story, to some extent, of the people who were trying to control all this and deal with it, because the authorities had a tremendous struggle getting to grips with this. It proved extremely difficult. So, and apart from Eric's article, obviously people have written about the famine. I wrote about it myself way back in the book that my PhD thesis turned into, The Making of the Crofting Community. It does have a chapter about the famine, and Tom Devine and others have written about the famine on the West Coast and in the Highlands subsequently. But other than Eric, nobody had ever really written up or tried to write up the protest movement on the East Coast. And that's really what this book majors on, though it has things to say, obviously, about the famine in the West as well.
Yeah, and I think you knit that together really effectively. And I think a lot of historians of the Highlands have tended to focus on longer periods, whether that's because of a perception or a genuine sense of the sources not allowing for that. So that actually makes this especially powerful as a book, I think, the fact that it is focused on that short period. And it's hugely impressive for a reader to read those accounts. So I don't want to hog the discussion any further. I could, but I don't want to. So I would like to offer anybody out there in the audience a chance to ask a question now to Jim, just by unmuting your mic. And if you could remember to mute your mic again after you finish, just to allow us to keep the discussion going. I'm sorry, I'm like a broken record here, but it's just very useful in terms of keeping the audio quality high. So I'm going to open that up to people now if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll see how that goes. Thanks.
This is Ron Beard across the water from Maine, and in fact, Rennie, and have long read your books as an education to Scotland. I was amused, this isn't a question, it's just an anecdote. I was amused because in the US, of course, we're seeing lots of protests around the George Floyd Black Lives Matter issue. And a Scottish friend commented on seeing the troops being sent to Portland, Oregon. Gosh, I hope that doesn't happen here. And having read your book, I was able to say, well, if you study Jim Hunter, you'll know that it did happen here. Anyway, it's been great to read your book, and I really appreciate this talk. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, it did happen, and it would happen again, of course, in a Scottish context as well. Not least in relation to something I mentioned in the bygoing, the crofting protests in the 1880s, when again the military would be deployed, though not usually with they certainly didn't open fire as they did in Caithness in 1847, but the military were involved at that time too. And of course, as I said, one of the extraordinary things about this, I found this really surprising actually, is that the authorities had tremendous difficulty laying their hands on forces to. They seem to have a rather more difficulty than President Trump in getting hold of forces to deploy. And I mentioned the gunboat that was sent to Bag Head. That was the only naval ship that was available in North Sea waters off the east coast of Scotland at that time. Now, this is extraordinary. Britain at that time was overwhelmingly the dominant naval power on Earth. And ironically, if the authorities had been trying to send soldiers from, let's say, Hong Kong to Shanghai, they'd have had no difficulty. The South China Sea was awash with British warships, but there were none in home waters. And equally, there were very few soldiers. There were only about 1,500 infantry soldiers available in Scotland at this time, because again, the military, the army was deployed around the empire. The one exception within the British Isles themselves, for fairly obvious reasons, was Ireland. There were many thousands of soldiers available to the authorities in Ireland, where always unrest was anticipated. But in Scotland, there were only a few hundred. And they didn't want to, and these were all, or almost all, in the central belt of Scotland. And they didn't want to send them north for fear that unrest was about to break out in the big cities like Glasgow. And so they had huge difficulty in deploying sufficient troops to bring the thing under control, which is partly why it lasted as long as it did.
Thanks for that, Jim. Thanks, Ron, for the question and comment. Really appreciate that. Anyone else have any questions or comments they'd like to make just now?
Yes,
Hi,
please.
Jim. It's Norman Newton here in Inverness.
We'll go for Norman first, and I couldn't hear who the second person was, but Norman, you go first, and the second individual will wait, and we'll let them come in after.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, thinking about the journalism that you quoted from in 1846 and 1847, I've been using the British newspaper archive lately to follow colonial battles in the 1880s and 1890s, and I was astonished to find that I was picking up reference to these events on anniversaries 25 or 50 years later. So I just wondered if you've picked up any comments later in the 19th century on some anniversaries, perhaps, to these riots and events in the Highlands in 1846 and 1847. And very specifically, did any of the children that you talked about, did any of them in later life perhaps refer back to their childhood experiences?
Well, that's very interesting, because I didn't think of that. I made huge use of the British newspaper, and again, being sort of long in the tooth in terms of doing historical research, I can well remember sitting in places like the lofts of newspaper offices to read physically the back issues of 19th century newspapers when I was doing research way back in the 1970s. And now, of course, in the British Newspaper Archive, there's this tremendous resource of 19th century newspapers. And with quite an extensive representation, as you'll know, Norman, of the northern half of Scotland. And unlike the good or bad old days when you had to read page after turn the pages and get completely sidetracked by some juicy murder or something or other. you now, of course, can search it. You can search the newspaper archive by subject or by individual or whatever. But it didn't occur to me to do that. And so that's interesting. To be honest, I never even thought of that. And so I'm not aware of anniversaries being mentioned, nor does there seem to have been much folklore. Well, if there was, again, I'm not aware of it having been recorded. What has happened since the book was published, and most spectacularly, when I gave a talk, not unlike the one I've just given, in the public library in Elgin just before Christmas. At the end of the talk, of course, there was opportunity for question and comment. And somebody, a gentleman, got up and said that he just wanted to let me know that John Young, whom I mentioned as one of the people who was in Millbank prison, and whose relatives had walked to Inverkeith to press for his release, that John Young was his great-great-grandfather. And talking with that gentleman subsequently, and perhaps indeed with a view to including a sort of postscript about this in any future paperback version of the book, it became apparent that these people, certainly John Young and his family and other people in Bughead, as far as we could establish, there was very little recollection in their families of what had happened to them. And what is interesting, however, is that John Young, I'm sort of in a sense giving the game away here because clearly they weren't transported in the end, they were released. And John Young came back to Hopman and became a successful fisherman and lived on into the later 19th century. And eventually he had his own boat, and he called the boat Liberty. And apparently it was commonplace in places like Baghead that boats were named in association with sort of major events that were going on at the time of their launch. And nobody really knew why this name Liberty, which has descended through boats in that family right down to the present day, nobody was really all that aware of where the name had come from. And they thought perhaps it had something to do with the fact that the boat or the first boat called Liberty went back to the time of the American Civil War, and it might have had to do with the freeing or the ending of slavery and that sort of thing. But now, of course, John Young's descendants are convinced that the name Liberty was a celebration of his own life and times. Now, but what was very striking, talking with his descendants, is that there was no tradition within the family of what he had done and what had happened to him. And it may be because I remember coming across something similar with regard to people who were arrested and jailed in connection with land raids and similar events in the late 19th, early 20th century. That in very recent times, these people have been portrayed very often, including by their own families, as pretty heroic folk who withstood and stood against oppression. But perhaps in their own lifetimes, to their own children and immediate descendants, the notion that their father had served time in jail as a criminal was not something they wanted to boast about. So it's not something I would claim to make any authoritative statement on, but it's interesting. It's interesting what you say about the anniversaries and so on. And I do think also there was some sort of connection in places like Caithness and Easter Ross, where there was a lot of unrest, that there was a kind of crossover between that earlier protest movement and the sort of land crofting related agitations of the 1880s. And both of these localities were very much to the fore at that time as well. But again, that's just speculation on my part. I have no real evidence of a direct remembered linkage between the two events.
Yeah, I wonder about the linking of the events with Ireland in people's minds as well, how powerful that might have been at the time. We have time for at least one more question from the person who was just coming in when Norman did simultaneously. If you'd like to ask your question now, that would be fine.
Thank you, David. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, fine.
That's great, thank you. Hello, Mr. Hunter. My name is Ewan McNeil, calling from Nairn. I'll get to the question in a while, but my great grandfather and great granny were from Barra, and they had to. The deal was, as you're probably aware, they had to sign for a bag of oatmeal, and the deal was they had to get on the Admiral from South Uist. It seems that our folks and a few other folks at the time signed for a bag of oatmeal sustenance, but then smuggled the boat to come to the mainland because they didn't hear about the journey to Canada being great. Now, the question was that when our folks settled in Nairn after coming via Inverness, in a family, there is kind of verbal passed down that there was some resentment in Nairn, probably because they were Gaelic speakers and Roman Catholic as well at the time. But I just wondered if, given the riots that were happening in Murray, etc., I wonder if them coming from the Hebrides, apart from these factors, if some of the resentment that was to them at the time might have been exacerbated by the situation in Murray with the grain.
I suppose it's possible. I couldn't be definitive about that. What was certainly the case is that some of the grain, I didn't mention this, but particularly in the case of Caithness, some of the grain that was being shipped, not so much from Wick and Pulteney Town, but from Thurso, was actually destined for famine relief in the islands. And no distinction, as far as I'm aware, was being made by the protesters. They wanted to keep the grain in Caithness, irrespective of where it was, whether it was headed for Leith or Barra was neither here nor there. And so I suppose that's possible. There was a huge amount of sympathy across the whole of Scotland for people in the Highlands and Islands who were suffering famine. Enormous amounts of money, many millions of pounds in today's value, were raised for famine relief efforts in the islands and the West Highlands, in the Scottish cities and towns. So I don't know. It's obviously interesting what you say, because I know of the people who were being kicked out of Barra and who fetched up literally on the streets in Inverness, as they did another group of them in Glasgow. And so there could be something of that. There was, Nairn was kind of on the frontier, the frontier for centuries. I'm now trespassing into areas where I am no expert historian, but the frontier between Gaelic and Scots, or Nordic as it's now called, for centuries, was round about Aldern, just to the east of Nairn. So Nairn and the hinterland of Nairn would itself have been Gaelic speaking, to some extent, not so much Nairn itself, the town, but you wouldn't have had to go far into the countryside in the 1840s to find Gaelic still being spoken. And there are comments about that at the time, but there could be that animosity, and of course, as you say, the religious element could have something to do with that as well. Though, just I don't want to go on about this indefinitely, but one of the striking things about the clerical involvement in famine relief in Scotland as opposed to Ireland was that the Free Church, which comes out very well out of the famine story, the Free Church was astonishingly non-sectarian. The first famine aid to reach Barra, for instance, came from the Free Church. That was very different to Ireland, where to this day there's resentment about the extent to which Protestant churches engaging in famine relief would attempt to make conversion to Protestantism condition of
Yeah.
eating the meal. And there seems to be nothing like that in Scotland, as far as I'm aware.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. It's pleasing to hear.
Thank you.
Good to hear from you, Ewan. Thanks for that. Just hang on a second. Yeah, thanks everyone. I think this is a lunchtime seminar, so I think we're running out of time here. We perhaps got time for one more question if Jim's if Jim's able to wait for that. So if you want to ask a question now, here's a final chance.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Hello. Let's see if I can do the video. Okay, perfect. Hi, current PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and my research involves the Isle of Harris and John Morrison, known as Ian Goa. And so I've come across this in my own research about the significance of the Free Church involvement quite early on in the famine, and you know, securing vessels to bring up meal and things from Glasgow and elsewhere. So I just wanted to comment on how significant this book has been for my own research and for the contributions for what I'm looking at right now in my own studies.
Well, thank you for that, and I wish you well with your own studies. So thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody, and most especially to Jim for a fantastic presentation. And it strikes me that he's sort of, in a way, it's kind of re-centered the history of the north of Scotland in that period. There's the material from Murray, from Banffshire, also integrating material from the Western Highlands, the Western Isles, and Caithness into one whole, and it works extremely well, but it reads quite differently because of that, and I find that really impressive about the book. But thanks very much to Jim, and thanks to everybody for your comments. If you want to further this discussion, we could certainly do that on Twitter. We'll also put details of the video up if you want to watch that and pass it on to other people who weren't able to attend, because I know there are a lot of Zoom calls and video calls that impede on our time just now. It's quite hard to prioritize, but I hope you've all felt this one was worth your lunchtime hour. I certainly learned a lot from it myself. So thank you very much to Jim, and thanks to everybody else. And just to say very, very briefly, our next talk, as I said, is on the Thursday, the 13th of August, by my colleague Ian Robertson. It's part of a series of talks put on by the Centre for History at UHI, partly in response to lockdown, making the most of the systems we have to bring presentations to people. So I hope you found that valuable and useful. So just we'll raise our appreciation in the usual way, Jim, but you might not hear all of the applause, but I can assure you it will be resounding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to say, if anyone who's still there, if you're having trouble finding out how to leave the call, the buttons, if you move your cursor on the screen, the buttons at the bottom, the one on the very right-hand side, you should see a red X, a red button with a white X. If you just click on that, and that takes you out of the call. And it's just quite important that you do leave the call so that we can close this